Hoi,
Hola.
ahlan wa sahlan.
Ahoy.
Sveiks.
Привіт.
Hello.
Ciao. Salut. Hello.
And welcome to Policy Voices by Friends of Europe, an independent think tank with a difference. Each week from Brussels, we bring you powerful conversations with policy voices from around the world. Policy Voices talking policy choices.
And what we're seeing is still a stalling. So we still don't have the necessary laws in place that actually ensure protection. And laws are very often the last line of defense of LGBTI people, but overall minorities, especially in a political context where it gets more difficult.
Hello and welcome to Policy Voices, Friends of Europe's weekly podcast on European and global affairs. I'm your host, Catarina Vila Nova. For today's show, I spoke with Katrin Hugendubel, Advocacy Director at ILGA Europe. Katrin warns that in Europe, we still don't have the necessary laws in place that protect LGBTI community, and laws are very often the last line of defense of LGBTI people. The LGBTI community is usually a target of the far right, being used as a scapegoat, and this year's European elections were no exception. From Hungary to Italy, the examples are many, but surprisingly, France stands as a sign of hope. Why is that? Even though Katrin is concerned about the upcoming elections, she reminds us that just a few months ago, France enshrined the right to abortion in its constitution. Here's my conversation with Katrin Hugendubel, Advocacy Director at ILGA Europe. Katrin Hugendubel, good morning and welcome to Policy Voices. Thank you so much for joining me today and for taking the short trip from your offices to our offices at Friends of Europe on a rather gloomy day. It doesn't even seem like today is the start of summer, but anyways, welcome and thank you for joining me.
Good morning and thanks for having me.
So we are talking today still in the post-election scenario, and because it is still Pride Month, we at Policy Voices wanted to do a specific episode focusing on what the results of the elections will mean specifically for the LGBTQI+ community. And that's why we have you today on the show to comment on that. But before we talk about what happened just a few weeks ago, I want to go back to shortly a month before the elections, where ILGA Europe warned that Europe was not equipped against attacks from the far right, so sort of a premonition of what was going to happen. Why this warning? What happened there?
Well, there are two reasons for this warning. The one is that over the last few years, and particularly the last 2 years, we've seen this significant rise in hate and violence across Europe and Central Asia. We really see how an increased political discourse that's polarized, that's hateful, where politicians, governments are not shying away from using the community as scapegoats, as kind of rallying up their own voters, is translating into violence. So that is a real warning sign. But the other reason why we said Europe's not equipped is that we do a mapping of the legal situation, the protection of the fundamental rights of LGBTI people every year. And what we're seeing is still a stalling. So we still don't have the necessary laws in place that actually ensure protection. And laws are very often the last line of defense of LGBTI people, but overall minorities, especially in a political context where it gets more difficult. Maybe to show an example is, for example, Italy, where we've seen Italy has been one of the lowest ranking EU countries on our rainbow map, where we map the legal protection of LGBTI rights for many, many, many years. And what we've seen since Meloni came into power was how easy it was for this government to now attack LGBTI rights without changing any laws, because those laws don't exist. So certain regions in Italy could deregister lesbian mothers in the absence of proper adoption rights for same-sex couples. You know, regions could discuss withdrawing support for trans kids at school, making access to trans healthcare more difficult, again, in the absence of legislation. So that's why we felt it's really an important moment in May around Ida Hobbit to actually call the warning to governments to say you need to put in place legal protections, you need to renew your own national action plans, your strategies, and also on EU level, the EU LGBTIQ strategy. We urgently need a strong commitment from the new Commission President and the Commission to actually renew that, because these are the documents and the laws, the engagements that will protect the community if the political situation keeps further changing to the right.
And during the election period, so during the time that the politicians and the candidates were on the streets campaigning and trying to get the vote, did ILGA Europe see any specific examples of the LGBTQI plus community being instrumentalized or being used as a scapegoat? In here, of course, specifically from the far right, in order to rally the voters?
Every 5 years, we see another hot topic in the election campaigns, right? And I think this year it was very much around the Green Deal, around the advances, or how there were plans from the far right to stop those advances further. So we haven't seen a huge focalization on LGBTI rights, but we did hear these reports from our members on the ground. I just yesterday spoke with organizations in Romania who said that, at least 2 candidates have used really hateful speech against the LGBTI community, one talking about cancelling and forbidding prides if she was elected. But also here in Belgium, I've heard from people who've been campaigning in Flanders how they've seen the far right, but also the far left going around communities saying how certain parties would, under the ban of gender, kind of force sexual education on children in schools. So these myths and these fears are further spread, and we've seen this in these elections, unfortunately, as well, yes.
One way that ILGA Europe found to counter that hate is that you put together this campaign, Come Out for Europe. Just before we record, you told me that you had more than 1,000 pledges. So candidates running for a seat in the European Parliament would come out for Europe. So they would pledge to support LGBTQI plus rights were they elected. And you told me that 10% of this 1,000 actually got a seat. So we'll see them here in Brussels and in Strasbourg. But my question here is, so once they sign a pledge, how can you make sure that they actually fulfill it? How can you make sure that it wasn't just a way for candidates to, being known and being seen, but now that they will actually fulfill their promises?
First of all, we keep ourselves the right actually to not accept signatures of candidates. So we would not, accept any signature of anyone if they have an absolute negative track record on voting on LGBTI rights, be it in national parliament or the European Parliament, if they have a track record on hate speech against the LGBTI community, but also further, if they have a track record of xenophobia and racism, for example, we have, put out a disclaimer that we would not accept that. So we try to do a first check already at the time of signature. But of course, as you say, the real work starts when they're elected, because this is when the promises need to turn into real work. So at the moment, we're working very closely with a few allies that we have already from the last legislature to set up a strong LGBTI intergroup again. So to really bring people together, cross parties, to kind of create majorities on important votes around LGBTI rights. But also we will be, really getting in touch with all of the people who have signed the pledge. We will be monitoring their work. We will call upon them to, take up rapporteurship or shadow rapporteurship for important files for LGBTI people. So we really want to create close cooperation. One thing we did stress in the pledge this time was also how MEPs work together with LGBTI organizations. So we will make sure that, they're in close contact with activists on the ground, that actually their work is informed by what's needed, because I think that's what we've seen, unfortunately, in the past sometimes as well, that in this polarized political context, even well-intentioned actions from MEPs here in Brussels can be seen as actually being counterproductive by activists on the ground, because they're saying this is not exactly what we need, or this is fueling the division even further. It would be better to actually adjust the message in that way. And this is really where we want to create a close cooperation. And we want to also kind of increase the sensitivity of members of the European Parliament, what it actually means in increasingly critical times to work with activists and organized civil society.
And in the end, the top signature, the top 5 EU parties that signed the pledge were the Greens, the S&D, the Left, and Renew. Any surprises there?
I don't really think surprises. We had very good cooperation with all of those groups. I think the Greens came out on top, and they have been very clearly the most consistent. And I think also throughout all countries, so throughout all member parties of the European Greens, have been very consistent on LGBTI rights. So in that sense, no, it's not a surprise to us. But I also want to mention that, of course, we have very good allies in the EPP, and looking at the majorities in the parliament, I think a big focus of us and of others will be that we will need to see how we're actually creating an even stronger consensus within, also the center, as we call it at the moment, to support LGBTI rights and human rights overall.
And how concerned is ILGA Europe that the EPP, which is still the biggest party in the European Parliament, perhaps will align more to the right than to the left? Was not one of the top signatories, but in general. So in here, I want to start a bit talking about a commentary post-elections that, of course, there was the shift across the continent to the right, perhaps not as seismic as we were expecting it to be, but a shift to the right nonetheless. So what will this mean in practice for LGBTQI rights across the continent? Are we in danger of losing any achievements that the community was able to achieve up until now?
What we said in our very first reaction to the elections is that I think it's really important to look at the result not only as a European Parliament result, but a broader reflection, and to see it together also with national elections that have been happening in the EU and will be happening in the near future. It's true, if we only look at the European Parliament, as you say, I think many expected a shift to the far right that would have been even bigger. So in that sense, it's a reassuring result. I think it's reassuring that, some groups on the center-left and center had, for example, MEPs in countries where they didn't have any representation before. So in that sense, that there are positive things in that result. Looking at all the debates I've seen in the week after the elections, I have to say I'm not so reassured about this slogan that we constantly hear about the center holds. I think they've been very worrying statements, especially by Manfred Weber, who's the new chairperson and the old chairperson of the EPP, about, looking to make pragmatic politics, I think he called that, and how that would mean working with Meloni as a pragmatic government as well. I think there's been a lot of talking down who's actually far right and who all of a sudden is more accepted center right. So we're staying very alert, but it's true, it could have been worse. I think the bigger picture is really we've seen governments in the EU change as well. And I think from an LGBTI perspective, where 3 years ago we had Poland and Hungary blocking any mention of gender in any council formation, that group is growing. I mean, we've seen a very, very positive outcome of the elections in Poland, and we're seeing how Poland has been supporting, for example, a key case on trans people's freedom of movement in the Luxembourg the Luxembourg Court of Justice has actually changed their intervention from being against the case to a positive support of the European Commission. We've seen Poland speak out in EPSCO on Thursday very positively on adopting finally the Equal Treatment Directive that has been blocked for 14 years in the Council. So we see that shift as well, but we have seen the shift in the Netherlands. We see the elections in France coming up. And we've seen in May that when the Belgian presidency invited all member states to sign a declaration to call on the Commission to renew the EU LGBTIQ strategy, there was, we had 18 member states sign. And so there's a growing group that we are worried about. And I think it's really worrying what will happen in the European Council, but also what it will mean for the next European Commission. So our focus is to continue the even closer work we have with some member states who've become much more outspoken and more active on supporting fundamental rights and LGBTI rights over the last 5 years, I would say. So we want to continue building on that. But also now in the process of forming the next European Commission, the commissioner hearings in autumn will be crucial. I think all of these are very important steps in the changed political landscape at the moment.
And still in this post-election scenario, which countries showed to be the most promising? Where did you see most signs of hopes? of hope, and which countries is ILGA Europe more concerned?
Poland has been in the last months a sign of hope for everyone, not only because of the outcome, but I think also because of the mobilization we've seen, also because of we've seen how civil society from different areas, so be it the environmental organization, with the women's rights organization, with the LGBTI organizations, have worked together to really make that change happen. I think that's an important sign of hope. I think equally, and you probably don't expect me to mention France as a sign of hope, and we're all very, very worried about France at the moment, but I think that the initiative to get abortion rights enshrined in the French constitution was very, very important and very, very timely. And that's exactly what we mean when we say, are we equipped for the far right swash that we're seeing at the moment? That was a step that politicians and activists decided they needed, looking at the US, seeing what happened there, and going, we need to secure our rights even further. And I think we need to see more of that moving forward.
And of course, you already mentioned briefly before that in just a few days, Hungary will take over the presidency of the Council. What is the biggest concern here? Since it's, at the end of the day, it will take over for 6 months. So is it just a matter of, policy proposals will just be put on hold, certain discussions will be put on hold, and then we just have to wait for them to vacate the seat and let the next ones come in? Or can we actually see some setbacks?
I mean, it's no secret that the Hungarian government has not been very strong and has actively attacked LGBTI rights through the anti-LGBTI law, but also overall on the foreign agent law, like how they've been trying to undercut civil society organizations and fundamental rights. So, of course, reason to worry. But I think it's a bit, as you say, very often in the past we've seen EU presidencies that are not in favor of LGBTI rights kind of parking that for the 6 months. So very often it's just that we don't expect any progress on any of the files. We will do everything we can with other member states that we're working closely with to make sure that in files that are being discussed at the moment, like, for example, the EU parenthood recognition proposal, Hungary sticks to being an honest broker as much as possible. We don't expect progress on these files basically for the next 6 months, but I think that's how far it can go. Really interesting will be to see that the infringement procedure that's going on against Hungary at the moment, based on the anti-LGBTI law, is expected to be heard in the Luxembourg court after the summer. We don't have an exact timing yet, but that will coincide probably with the Hungarian presidency, and I think we'll need to see how that's playing out, as I think overall the whole discussions on Article 7 and how strong the Commission will stand against an active presidency.
Something that caught my attention, as I was reading on ILGA Europe's work, is the topic of international policies. And so that ILGA Europe does not only advocate for the rights of the LGBTI community, but also the racial communities and the importance of tackling climate change, which perhaps some people think of your organization as advocating for just one specific issue, but actually you highlight the importance of the interconnectedness of all these issues. Can you elaborate on that and talk a bit about that?
With pleasure, actually. I mean, we're all more than one thing, right? So no gay person or no trans person or no intersex person is only that. We come from different backgrounds. We have different day-to-day realities. We have different, physical impediments. So this is shaping our reality, and I think we're not moving forward on true non-discrimination if we continue to look in things in silo. I also think we've seen way too many attempts by an anti-human rights opposition to actually divide groups, to divide and conquer. We've seen this very, very actively between the trans community and a women's rights community, where the attempts to really play out one group against the others are so obvious. But we've also seen it before on kind of, some conservative forces using LGBTI rights to argue against immigration and actually granting refugees rights. And all of these things are extremely worrying to us, are things where we feel we need to actively stand up. We're stronger together. We need to work in coalition and in alliances. We need to support each other. And in the end, human rights are not a cake where, you get a piece and then it's gone. It's an holistic approach. As I said also on the pledge, we were saying that for us, if you're a pledger for LGBTI rights under the Come Out, that also means we'll hold you accountable on your work on human rights in general. And that's really a key principle for us.
And looking ahead to the next 5 years, when new MEPs will come to the parliament, we'll have a new commission, perhaps not a new president of the commission, but a new commission nonetheless. Where will ILGA Europe focus on? What specific policy proposals would you push for and you would like to see approved?
As I said, at the moment we're working, and again, we're doing this in coalition with, for example, the European Disability Forum, European Network Against Racism, Age Europe, so with many other organizations, IPPF Europe as well, on kind of ensuring that the advances we've seen, because it's true, the last commission, I think the Union of Equality, that might seem like a symbolic statement, has actually led to more initiatives coming from the European Commission. I think more coordinated work, for example, between the gender equality strategy and the LGBTIQ strategy. So we've seen these advances. They're never enough. They're often blocked in the Council. They're often not followed up by the European Commission as well. We have important judgments by the Court of Justice, like the Coleman judgment on freedom of movement for same-sex couple, which is still not implemented. We're still not seeing infringement. So I'm not saying everything was great, but we've seen advances. And I think we all feel we need to be very alert at the moment to keep pushing that these things that have been put in place actually continue. So we need a strong mission statement for equality and anti-discrimination for the next commission as well. We need to see these strategies renewed. And we need to see very, very clear proposals in these strategies as well. So I've already mentioned we have the recognition of parenthood proposal from the Commission on the table. So which means if you're a parent in one country, you're also a parent in another EU country, as President von der Leyen put it, which should be a given, but for same-sex couples still isn't across Europe. But we need to see that complemented, for example. There are issues for trans people having their legal gender recognition not recognized when they cross an internal EU border. So we need a piece of legislation that's going beyond parenthood recognition, for example. But also, like one area we're pushing a lot is, we need to see in the area of social policies on homeless and housing, that LGBTI are clearly defined as target groups and that specific actions are actually defined that the European Commission will do to tackle that. We've seen in the third LGBTI survey from the Fundamental Rights Agency that came out in May, yet again, how, looking at intersectionality, so looking at people with disabilities, homeless people having problems making ends meet, how discrimination rises, how access to services across the board, be it social services, be it healthcare services, drops significantly. So we need specific actions, communications, draft legislation, best practice exchanges between member states seen from the Commission in these areas.
Katrin, thank you so much.
Thank you very much.
Thank you for staying on that side and listening to my conversation with Katrin Hugendubel, Advocacy Director at ILGA Europe. If you want to comment on this episode, you can search for Friends of Europe on LinkedIn and X or send us an email. Our address is press@friendsofeurope.org. As always, don't forget to subscribe to Friends of Europe's podcast wherever you get your podcasts to never miss an episode of Policy Voices. I'm Catarina Vila Nova and I'll be with you again next week. Until then, goodbye.